from A to B, C, and D. And so the cost, the unitary cost, or whatever you want to call it, would be like $1,300. But that happens with passengers, but not with freight. With freight, actually, they make these chain trips. It's like a traveling salesman problem. They go from one place to the other place. It's the same truck delivering to different customers. So you go in a cycle like this to deliver from A to all of the other nodes, which has at least a 40% difference in total cost. That's the way less than truckloads, so trucks that are not complete with one single customer, operate. That cannot be put into a gravity model like the ones used in the four-step models. So that doesn't work. So generation for passengers work, but for freight doesn't work because there are many previous trips. For instance, if I want to fabricate this Samsung telephone, I buy semiconductors from China, I buy plastic from Southeast Asia, and I buy the glass from Morocco, or whatever. I assemble this in Vietnam and then send it to Italy, and you use your phone. So all those trips are not conservative in the sense of the four-step model. The four-step model needs that if you have a node and you have an incoming flow, the outgoing flow is the same as the incoming flow. Here it doesn't happen. You have glass, plastic, semiconductors, whatever. You have a time to process that, and nothing of that goes out. That dies off there, and a telephone goes out. And then the telephone goes wrong, and it's sent back in reverse logistics. It's sent back to the seller to be fixed. And when it's fixed, it's sold in a special outlet mall for refurbished electronics. So the idea of mass balance is lost in freight. With people, hopefully that doesn't happen. If a person goes to a node, a person should leave the node unless something terrible happens. That's with distribution. Model split. ROM is not for the drink, but for the random utility models, which is as good as the ROM. Well, but here it doesn't hold because of many things. The intermodalism, so there's not only competition between modes, there's a lot of cooperations. So if I'm a trunking company, I better compete with the shipping companies to say, okay, if you give me the contracts, I will charge you less than to a single buyer of my services. So they cooperate with each other. So the competence is not between modes, but between chains, which is more complicated. And it doesn't include what is called the last mile logistics. The logistics in a city like Rome, like London, like Sao Paulo, whatever, is very, very complicated. You cannot go, if you go to any cafeteria or kiosk or whatever newspaper place, and you want to buy a Diet Coke, you will find it there. How does it get there? It doesn't come in a large truck. From the large truck goes to a distribution center. In distribution centers, someone in a car goes and buys 50 bottles of or cans of Coca-Cola. Those, with the car, goes to a place where a guy in a bicycle gets 10 of them and goes to the newspaper stand and leaves 5 of them to be sold. So that's the last mile logistics, and it's not included in these model split models. and it's a very complicated logistics. Traffic assignment, for those of you, there's an A missing here, who know economics, wardrobe is like Nash equilibrium, in which when you're in an equilibrium, there's no way you can change your route, improving your own situation, because you're gonna be worse, so that's the equilibrium. That doesn't hold in traffic assignment with freight, because the node-to-node movement they do is not the shortest path. The node-to-node decision is made on the whole trip, the trip chain. So not necessarily through the minimum shortest path. So in search of a better choice, what can we do? There's a few examples that have been done in Europe and the US. This is the Netherlands example. It's sort of the 4-step model, but including all that is in freight. It looks complicated. It is not looking complicated. It's very complicated. If you think in the analytical way of putting a function, a model, a mathematical model in each one of these boxes, interacting with each other, is huge and complicated. So if it's not complicated enough, there are people who are more complicated than Dutch, which are, perhaps some of you are from the UK. Very complicated. They think big and complicated. This is the UK model. If the Netherlands is complicated, this one is impossible. I mean, if you do it with analytical models and try to incorporate all the interactions between empty trips, dangerous goods, explosives, and fresh food, and frozen food, and stuff like that, this is terrible. And if you incorporate that you buy fresh vegetables from Italy, leather from Morocco, and that goes to the UK, that's impossible to complete. We did some still very complicated and probably impossible in Chile, trying to get rid of the most complicated interactions in the Netherlands and the UK model. But still, this is not a 4-step model. This is a complicated model that goes from the input-output matrix to OD matrix at the user level. So, if you try to go the same way that passengers have done with mathematical models to describe every single movement of people, we are lost. We are lost because the time frame in which you get the data is very long. An OD study could take 2 or 3 years to get the data validated, calibrated, whatever. You use the model for your purposes 5 years later. That's old. People change very quickly, especially with technology. Things happen very quickly, much more quickly than 10 years ago when we didn't have WhatsApp. We didn't have these, what's the name of the car movement that we use for highways? Waze, to tell you the congestion or whatever. So things are happening like that, and your models and your dynamic models with derivatives, equations, and stuff like that are not able to cope with this movement. The stochastic treatment of models is another piece that is complicated, and there's 2 ways to deal with that. This is the way that I don't like, is treating everything analytically from a stochastic perspective. But you need to take care of every single detail that is there to get a very complicated model that, in order to be used, have to be very specific, narrow, thinking that many aspects of behavior are taken out of the model, otherwise it's impossible to calibrate. So this is not the way I would like to incorporate stochasticity into models. I show it to you because there are people who like that, and that's fine. That's fine for mathematicians. But if you want to use this in planning or public projects, it's not very useful. For instance, the value of time is a magnitude that is used to decide whether a project, for instance, a highway or a tunnel, is viable or not. For instance, the Eurotunnel between England and France, when it was evaluated, it was a very good investment. Once it was operating, the number of movement of vehicles was like half the one predicted. If you had had that half number of trips, that tunnel had never been constructed. So there is a tendency to sort of increase the number of trips to make projects happen. This is the value of time, namely how much a minute for a person is worth. And as you can see, of course, is a distribution. It's not a number. What of these numbers do you use in your project? Well, you tell me if you want to do the project or not. If you don't want to do the project, use these numbers, which are true. If you want to do it, go this way. So that's very qualitative. We're dealing with people here who likes analytical models, very analytical and very complicated mathematical models. But in the end, the decision is always political and qualitative. So this is a problem. What I like of agent-based models is an idea brought from people working in complex systems. I don't know if you know the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems or other institutes that deal with systems that are made of small agents like cellular automata, which is a very simple complex concept. There's an entity that makes simple decisions, like a robot. If I go straight and find something like an object, either turn right or left. If I turn right and there's an object, turn left. And if I turn left and there's an object, go backwards and stuff like that. And so you have thousands and thousands of these units making decisions. And when you put them all together, working with these simple rules, something emerged from the total system of these agents. That's the core of the problem. There have many physical systems that have been studied with these models. For instance,
Ant colonies, for instance? Ant colonies?
Ant colonies could be one of them. Ants follow a path of pheromones, and there are many systems that work with very simple units that make a few decisions. And the complex part is that the behavior of one unit is completely different from the behavior of the system. Have you seen in those, the Animal Planet, those fish, groups of fish that move together and they look like a large fish, but they're small fish? Well, they don't know how they do that. They just follow the tail of the next fish. By doing that, they transform in a complex system that moves in a way that allows them to live longer than those fish that don't do that. So that's the principle. And that's the things that these people have done with these models. You can actually have models that adapt the learning process and learn what happens in the past. So if an ant model learns that if the ant walks very long to get the food and nothing happens, if this is the ant colony, every single ant will go out walking, leaving a pheromone trail. The next one will follow the path with the more intense smell of the pheromone. Which one it is? It is the one that went the shortest path to get food and came back to the colony. So it has twice as much pheromones than the other one that went that way, found something and it's still not coming back. The third ant will smell this path and go that path and that path until it dries off and it follows the other path and so on and so forth. That's a typical complex system agent. And complexity can deal very well with this hideous phrase. In real life, do you know anything that happens ceteris paribus, namely everything else constant?
Yes, in the textbooks.
Textbooks, yes, of course.
That's the only place.
Exactly. You have a regression model, linear regression model that says everything in the world is static, but your dots, follow the dots, draw a line, and that's the answer. Because in the future, we will follow the same path. But economy changes, we have recessions, we have people that change their minds. So the system, as people in complex systems, the system dances around your model. If you're trying to optimize, I come from the OR field, optimization, and I like optimization models. So you have a huge optimization model in which everything is constant in the borders, and you find a maximum. But when you're going to use it, the system danced already, and probably your hill is now a downhill, and it doesn't work in reality. It works in your paper, and you can publish, and you can get money for that. But in practice, it doesn't work because the system is never ceteris paribus. It's always something changing. With agent-based, you can have that. You can have thousands of agents making decisions, like in the stock market. There are people buying, selling, being proactive, being risk takers, risk averse, whatever. So if you put them all together, what emerges is very different from the behavior of one single agent. And the models that we have showed here is that one single agent following the random utility model controls the whole system. One agent is equal to the amplification of thousands of people who think like him or her. I will stop here and I'll tell you that there are a few experimental examples of people working with complex systems in transportation for assignment to networks, in which there's a theory called car following, developed by Professor Robert Herman during the 50s or 60s, which are used for designing streets and the traffic lights timing to optimize that. And that's a very old way of thinking of a complex system, in which your car, if you're driving your car, you accelerate until you see the red light of the other car in front of you, so you decelerate. And you decelerate at a rate that is usually faster than the way you accelerate. And so if you have a system of that, there's a lot of waves that go back and forth, and you can predict how traffic moves. It was sort of the initial steps of complex systems. Now there are software that you download for free. For instance, NetLogo is net, N-E-T, logo, L-O-G-O, and you can run simple models with agents, and you can program your agents. You can ask the agents to do whatever you want. There's a researcher, Laszlo Barabasi. Laszlo Barabasi works in Harvard now in complex systems. He's working with the Cancer Research Center, trying to do studies of cancer using these complex systems and networks that behave in a different way as a single agents. Transportation networks, biological networks, and many other networks that are not random have specific behavior. And that behavior that so far has emerged is that certain nodes attract people or whatever in a different manner than other nodes. So you can plan, for instance, I work with emergency logistics and logistics for terrorism. If you have a network, a transportation network, you can choose nodes that a terrorist could attack to destroy the network. Not all the nodes of the network have the same probability to damage the network. So they can, using these procedures, they can find which nodes are the critical nodes. So if you know that in advance, you can plan for protecting those nodes better than the others. All of those analyses can be done fairly easy with agent-based models. The problem with agent-based models, if you're a mathematician or someone very analytical, is that there's not a function. So you cannot write an equation that describes what's going to happen with the system. Well, I can live with that because the model will serve your purpose of using it in practice. Otherwise, you would have a set of equations that will be very complicated but very narrow, because if anything happens with the ceteris paribus, the system changes in any single thing, your model is not going to work anymore. So that's my message for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I think it's Antonio's turn to have a discussion for the...
Thank you very much. And during your presentation, I have impression on the practice of the model that we have. We have at the end we have.
Antonio, why don't you be there so that we get both of you on the video?
Because we have a lot of models that I saw, but I think that we have to divide at the beginning, referring to the area that we want to simulate. For example, at the end, I think that the general framework is useful to have the input for international level, after we have a national level, regional level, and finally we have the urban level. But I think that we can, around the world, we have seen two examples in Netherlands and in the UK, we have a general framework. But I think that our idea is that these models have to be used by the practitioners around the world, that a very complex model is not useful for them, because I think that now we have the potential to have a good framework. But we have to remind that this model should be used by the practitioners, and probably the very articulated and framework should be implemented in a decision support system, for example. Because I think that this is a good challenge for the future. And at the end, I think that we have to divide this model if we want to simulate chips or commodity. My idea is that commodity is useful, because I think that the decision maker want to move from commodity, not trucks.
Right.
A trucks is a tool to move commodities. And then, but when we have to divide the different, using the traditional structure of passengers, generation, distribution, multimodal choice, I think that these events can be adapted to the scale that we want to simulate. And I think that a good stream, we can divide, what is your idea on modeling for international and for urban? Because my idea, my experience is that for international level and for urban level, we have two different scale, two different models. And then for new, for example, here we have some people that for the first time, students and so on. And I think that we have divided the scale of the problem, because the problem is different. And at the end, my idea is it's important to have models that consider the modification of policies. Right. In particular when we have national models. They want to simulate if I change, for example, in a city, 10 windows, what happens? And finally, I think that the base problem of all modeling is that. Because we have a very useful framework, very good framework, but the problem is that. Because at the end, when we have a complicated framework, but the data to calibrate the single models, we have no data, or we have few data for our school. Then I think, as I interpreted your message, we have to consider a different scale, and we have to consider the difference in unit that we want to simulate according to the scale. And after you saying all the general actor, I think that it is useful to have data, specific data. That I think that the data are the very problem of this field, because I think that the research in this field is moving not as passengers, but is moving on. But the data is useful because the data sometimes are held by private companies, they are in competition and they want to do nothing. And so this is the big problem. I think, what do you think about scale and tools for practitioners and the possibility to use this modeling in order to incorporate the possibility to have the landscape change, the policies that the decision maker wanted to simulate, and at the end on data problem with your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The first question was about the scale. When you think of freight movement from one country to other country, the actual driver of that movement is not the country. It's someone like you in your computer. You go to eBay or whatever and buy your video camera from eBay and bet $100 and win the camera, and that means that someone in Shanghai got your camera and sent from Shanghai to the US and from the US to Italy. And so that international movement is not because Italy and the US are friends and they like to exchange gifts. It is because you bought a specific item. So he's an agent of this system, and there are millions of agents doing that. There are ways to deal with when you have many agents making these decisions, but there are ways to deal with that. That's one thing. If you need only the international portion, but you're not interested in the behavioral aspects, you can still do it in a very short time frame. You would say, in the next month, the number of shipments from